Hello, Big Italy 42 here with you once again. And for this Daily Academy podcast for dailyfantasycafe.com, I am talking about salary strategy. And as you'll see in the article below, I used NBA as some examples, but with MLB season kicking off now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about some strategies with MLB. So you'll see your examples down low, right there, average amount per total salary, number of roster spots, but I'm going to go ahead and break it down for you in MLB. So, if you're playing on FanDuel, you've got a $35,000 cap, which is $3,889 per player. On DraftKings, you have $50,000, and you have 10 slots, which is $5,000 per player. So, a player that's priced exactly the same on both sites isn't exactly going to be the same play on both sites, and I'll get into that here in just a minute. So when each player you roster as you're building your lineup, you're going to see your salary per player increase or decrease. For instance, on FanDuel, if you go ahead and slot in your pitcher first right away, if you have $35,000, for instance, if I'm playing tonight, Zach Greinke's pitching tonight, I slot him in, he's $10,000. My $3,889 goes down to $3,125 per player now. So depending on how you build your lineups, these things are very key because the last thing you want to do is build a lineup and just have the last player in your lineup only because they fit, not because they're a player you were already trying to target. So making sure you can structure your lineup in such a way that you can actually fit the players that you want is very paramount and key for success in DFS. So like I said, average remaining salary will increase, decrease depending both sites, and with DraftKings, you have two pitchers, whereas FanDuel, you have one pitcher. So FanDuel, you're going to decide whether you're going to pay up for your pitcher or not, and on DraftKings, you're going to decide whether you want to go a stud and a cheap player, two mid-range players, or if you really want to go with two expensive players, which is going to make it really tough on your lineup. So as you're going through your lineup, you're going to see differences there, and the sort of construction that you want to go with is to make your list of your players before you start building your lineup. So you want to do your research, all your due diligence beforehand, and try to make your lineup accordingly. And this prevents you from, like I mentioned earlier, going through your lineup, having a bunch of players that you like, all of a sudden getting to your last spot, and just selecting a player that you weren't a big fan of, but he just happens to fit in your lineup. And that's a good way to set yourself behind. I mean, you spend hours on research likely most days, reading the articles, podcasts we have here on Daily Fantasy Cafe, doing your own research outside of that. And the last thing you want to do is end up with a lineup that's less than ideal. So I'm going to break down some important keys to keep in mind when you're building your lineups aside from that. One is opportunity cost. A great example of that is today. It's April 7th. It's the second full day of MLB, and it was 8 games on the slate. 1 got rained out, and your opportunity cost is if there's a player that's a top option at a position and there's not that many other good options, it makes sense to go ahead and pay up for that player because it's going to be really hard to make up that ground. For instance, tonight, Troy Tulowitzki on FanDuel was $4,400, and there weren't a lot of other good options at small forward. I've got my NBA and MLB mix as we're going through, but either way, at shortstop today, there were not a lot of other good options. And Troy Tulowitzki, if you played MLB DFS last year or any other year, you know he's an elite talent, one of the best hitters in the game, even when he's away from Coors Field. And if everyone else plays Troy Tulowitzki, especially in cash games, and you do not, then you're behind the 8 ball very quickly, especially on a short slate of games. When there's an obvious top option, it makes more sense for you to pay up for that because it will cost you more money to fade that player in the long run than it would to just go ahead and pay up. So your opportunity cost is very, very high in fading a guy like Tulowitzki on what is now a smaller slate and him being the obvious top option. Next up is positional scarcity. It's another component of salary strategy, goes hand in hand with opportunity cost. Many times where there's a top option, like I was mentioning already with Troy Tulowitzki, and doing anything but that could be really costly. So what you need to do is, if there's a cheap alternative, for instance, a guy like Brandon Crawford against a lefty. Brandon Crawford is solid hitter against lefties. He's got some power. Not so great against righties. So he's a guy that you want to target. Maybe he's a decent swerve off of Tulowitzki. If he can save you a few $1,000s, you could bump up your starting pitcher there. But when you're looking at positional scarcity, it's a lot of times in the middle infield in Major League Baseball DFS because you don't have a lot of power options at a spot like second base, shortstop, things like that. So you're almost obligated in your cash games to pay up for a guy. And this goes back to the opportunity cost as well. Think of it this way. If you're going to pay up for a player in your cash games, you're expecting a certain amount of outcome from that said player. And if that said player pays off that outcome and you were the person that didn't play him in your cash games, all of a sudden you went cheap at that position, you upgraded elsewhere, and you are desperate for that other position to pay off. Whether it be starting pitcher, first base, whatever it may be, generally it's going to be your starting pitcher so that you can fit a bigger stud like a Clayton Kershaw in your lineup. But if there's one top option and a bunch of scrubs at that lineup, you really want to pay up at that position, and it makes a lot more sense for you. So to recap here, this is a really short one. Opportunity cost is very important. It's how much money it will cost you to not play the top player. And positional scarcity is when there is only one top option, especially on a shorter slate of games, what you need to do to get that guy in your lineup. Because if, say there's 3 to 5 games on an MLB slate, which is rare, there's one guy like a Tulowitzki who plays, has a big game, you don't have him, a lot of times it's not going to matter what's going on at the rest of your lineup. So this also plays into the Coors Field effect, which if a lot of times, as we know, the thin air, the ballpark factors, and Coors Field, you're going to need to play some Colorado Rockies and their opponents in those situations, and you're setting yourself really far behind with your opportunity cost, with your positional scarcity, with these players, because they have such higher value in that environment that it really hurts you to fade them. So if you have any questions about this, I'm at Big Italy 42 on Twitter. More than happy to answer your questions about this. And find me if you need any help with this. If not, read below. Pretty much summed it all up for you here. Obviously, each sport is unique. The description down below is about NBA, but I thought I'd do you a favor and talk about MLB since the season's just kicking off. So once again, I'll see you on some other podcasts and some more informative Daily Academy pods here. So I'll see you next time.